Now back to Brisbane, and in the sense of making the centre open again to the general population. This is called the Yellow Brick Road, the Magic Yellow Brick Road. And it's designed for the blind and the partially sighted, and it runs throughout the whole city centre. And it's a tactile surface that you feel through your feet. And blind people and partially sighted are trained to use it, and it gives them back again the city centre to you walk in, as it were, in dignity, as a genuine citizen, rather than as a disabled person that has to be helped along and treated differently. This was also very interesting, and again this is Brisbane. We're talking more and more about the notion of the 24-hour city and ways of creating conditions of safety. And this was an interesting planning game. It wasn't a planning game. In the main city centre of Brisbane, it had a bit of a reputation as a dangerous place at night. The planners of the City Council agreed to 3 food kiosks that run the length of the main mall. I mean, it's partly open, partly enclosed. Jim is on the mall, Jim is up. But one of the conditions for getting the franchise for these 3 kiosks was they had to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, instantly, that created this kind of atmosphere, this 24-hour kind of natural surveillance in the city centre by people sitting having coffee and so on. That changed the atmosphere from one of kind of fear, loneliness and emptiness into a place where you knew there would always be someone around at that 24 hours a day. And I think also one of the things that was very strong I learned from Australian cities is the notion that higher education now very much could be relocated or located in the city centre. And this is in Hobart in Tasmania, where the art school has been relocated down on the waterfront. I think in Liverpool in the UK, the planning department have been in touch in quite detailed negotiations with both the university and the Polytechnic to try to create thousands of units of residential accommodation for students in the city centre, because they feel that students are the cheapest policemen or police people you can have, and that their kind of irregular lifestyles are exactly the kinds of things that create a safer, more people city centre than any other. And I was recently reading, this is now a developer working on the south bank of the River Thames in London, is negotiating with a number of the hospitals, city centre hospitals, to locate student residential accommodation in the development, because he, the developer, thinks this will create a greater flexibility of people use in the development and make it a safer nighttime environment. That's the bus, the tram, the Melbourne tram that goes out to the university with appropriately kind of dictionary-type murals on the side. And we got very much the sense of time shifting, that those who were most imaginative responding to the crisis of the kind of the 9-to-5 city centre. And this was in Swansea, where the vicar of the city centre church, in desperation, an almost completely lost congregation, moved Sunday back to Wednesday and did a whole thing on Wednesday and kind of got his congregation back, but also got a kind of found an identity of going to the church in the city centre and began to be used for concerts and so on. More and more common in Australian cities is the 24. And I think we are looking to a future that will have to respond to the flexibility of demographic change. And one last statistic, and some demographics are more useful than others, but it's now, I'm told, and I've got the proof here in my file, if you don't believe me, that now more than half of the households in Paris are only occupied by one person. One person household, more than 50% of households in Paris. and the notion that the demographics is increasingly breaking down the traditional nuclear family of 2 adults, 2 children, is no longer the kind of relationship or the form of relationship that most people live in the city centre. There are more and more different kinds of comings together for shorter periods, more flexible domestic relations, and I think the city centre, to accommodate that, has to have this 24-hour, 7-day-a-week flexibility.
Thanks, Colin and Ken. While we're setting up for the next paper, we've got time for just a couple of quick questions. Yeah.
Just to, well, both of you, I suppose, although Colin perhaps can comment on it more. I thought that was rather quaint, that Red Cross, the Red Cross Centre, which was in City Hall, and a bit of a hangover from the past, as you rightly pointed out. But I find more interesting as a sort of example of people reclaiming a space in the city, but one that I find quite troublesome is the South Bank development. And I just wondered if Colin, you might make a comment on, or perhaps tell the audience a little bit about it and make a comment on what, if you have a view on it at least.
Yes, the South Bank development is what used to be the old Expo site, Expo 88 site in Brisbane. As is the history with these ex-Expo sites, they take a long time to make up their mind what they're going to do with them. In some cases, they don't do anything at all, as in the case of New York and Montreal and a number of other cities. But in the end, they did come up with a series of plans for the South Bank site. The first set of plans was for a rather fairly upmarket combination of, I can't remember the exact details now, but there was intentions for fairly expensive residential accommodation and middle-range residential accommodation, plus a public parkland. That was thrown out and modified to a certain extent because it was basically perceived as simply addressing the CBD area of the city and not talking to the community on the other side, which is the...
and then people actually find, and you've got that kind of, to me it just looks, well, like there's something going on, like the Disney World going on, but that's good to hear your very positive comment.
You know, and the other things, it's mostly free. If you don't want to go into the Gondwana rainforest or the butterfly house, then it's free.
Up the back.
I'd like to invite Ken Worpole to go beyond his self-confessedly piecemeal presentation, because it seems to be a very important question for our time. He gave us as an improving example, Stuart Littleton's redevelopment project. Now, although there are nice things in the use of that space, I take it that doesn't actually represent kind of urban regeneration policy that some people are thinking to projects for the 1980s, because I don't think it's good listen to it now.
No, I mean, obviously, it's certainly not how I would see urban regeneration in most parts of London. But given that that was in hand then, I mean, I've been there a number of times, at Broadgate at lunchtime, and it actually does work. I mean, there are large kind of public chessboards. I was surprised people actually do use them. People bring their sandwiches. They don't have to buy a very expensive kiosks or in restaurants. So I think, and I'm very conscious of finding places that work where there is genuine interaction between people. And I would say that Broadgate Arena is definitely one of them. I mean, at the weekends, of course, it's dead, and the whole development happens in an area that has mostly displaced its traditional residential community. So the whole project, of course, is not my idea of the way for urban renewal. But as a particular space, I do think that Broadgate Arena does work.
David?
I just want to
artistic going on. How do you guard against that reactionary sort of exclusionary politics?
I think I don't know if I can give a final answer to that question. I mean, you could never avoid the Sarajevo effect, effectively. that's the end answer. But I can give you an example from Australia where that particular track has been useful, and that's been in relation to Aboriginal communities in inner city areas, where traditionally the approach from worthy civilising bodies like the Australia Council and various arts funding bodies was to take them and get them to do their traditional crafts, or to get them to learn perhaps adaptations of Aboriginal dance, or midway between Aboriginal dance routines and jazz and so on. But where effectively the Aboriginal community themselves have said, no, we don't want that stuff, we don't want the handout stuff from the Australia Council and from arts funding bodies. We want to set up fashion design workshops, we want to set up media production workshops, we want to set up film workshops. We don't want handouts, we want industry. And they have constituted around a particular elements of the inner city infrastructure, in some cases, even in the most depressed parts of Redfern in Sydney and some inner city areas in Brisbane itself, their own, as it were, established, effective, developmental identity hinged around a cultural industry policy. Now, how, from the point of view of both government and from the local community, you would then go on to coordinate the relations between that community and, say, in the local Greek community and those ethnic communities and the dominant Anglo-Celtic culture, in the end I don't have a simple single answer to that. But I think that the cultural industry approach, as opposed to the older approach of patronage of those sorts of activities, is allowing much more access to the resources of identity than has hitherto been the case.
I mean, the cultural industry strategy was very much associated with the GLC, for whom I worked in, between 84 and 87. And I think that, for example, I mean, it was a funding of small independent workshops, but it was done on the basis of, funding of women's kinds of film activities, black film activities and so on. And I think we now have the beginnings of a genuine black film presence in this country, production capacity, and the beginnings of a kind of black filmmaking tradition. And that, I would say, absolutely comes out of GLC funding for Sankofa, for the Black Film Audio Collective, and is now taking, the shape of natural feature films, films that are coming on television. So I think, the cultural industry strategy can lay the foundations for genuine kind of new voices and generic traditions in cultural production. So I just don't have a problem with that.
Well, I don't have a problem with the positive side. I have a problem with all of these examples of the negative side. I can also cite the great the ethnic family and all that kind of stuff, which could easily come out of those versions of identity. In other words, you have to be very careful on this kind of politics. And it seems to be just as well on the positive side, which I agree with, and not to recognise the difficulties of the negative side is political danger. That's what I'm saying.
And I think then one needs kind of development within particular ethnic traditions, or but there also have to be spaces where people can come together. And I remain now convinced, because it happens to be the project I'm working on, that there's something extraordinary about the public library that we don't actually understand or can't unpack. But why is it that the public library is almost unique in any city centre in having the young and old, the black and white, the rich and the poor cohabiting in the same space? Well, of course there are problems associated, but it is an extraordinary achievement to have done that. And I think part of the reason is to do with the kind of, it's the books on the shelves create an atmosphere you don't feel you're being stigmatised for going in it. If you go into any other public institution, you're often stigmatised. And there's something about the library that creates value or adds dignity to people's presence in it, even if they're just reading the sporting press, it doesn't matter. And there's something about the library that I'm very interested in, because I think it is a space that is very genuinely democratic.
We might continue this discussion for a little longer at the, but we won't have a general discussion in that case at the end of the whole session.
I'd just like to point out that I feel that the example there is guy example together in that some of the generating factor is there is a valuing of
I can't answer that question in isolation from actually identifying what the cultural needs of that community might be. And we have done some work in that area on a project I've just completed in Western Australia, and it's clear that the majority of the Vietnamese community in this particular area north of Perth, their major concern is transport access to the local temple, the very splendid Buddhist temple set out in the middle of the northern suburbs of Perth, and that's an immediately identifiable cultural need. I mean, the research needs to be done, the consultation needs to be undertaken to identify precisely what the cultural needs are, and that process of cultural mapping is a very important component of the cultural planning, urban cultural policy process as a whole. It can't be identified in isolation from actually doing the consultation and the research and finding out precisely what their needs and expectations might be. I mean, the problems have been that we've tended to assume that these are the needs of these communities and provided centres and services which are completely irrelevant to those needs.
I guess the point I was trying to get at as well, and it's related to what they were talking about this morning, was about the palliative nature of what urban care.
Well, I confess to a social democracy in that area, but I'll let Ken know.
Well, I think the reason culture is so very important is that it has the capacity with very small resources to give meaning and identity back to places. Now, I mean, for example, some of the large suburbs of Sydney, with large immigrant populations, have been, when I was out there, I mean, people were talking about them in desperation, saying, you know, they were anonymous, they were anomic and so on. But interestingly, a number of crime writers have begun to give back to those suburbs a real kind of sense of place. And I think all cities have to be imaginatively constructed. I mean, that's, if you look at the book about LA by Mike Davis, City of Quartz, I mean, it's about the city interpreted largely by various cultural forms, whether it's rock music, Hollywood screenwriters and so on. And I do think that there is a power that the artist or the writer can have, coming from the women's movement or whatever, to give a sense of dignity and space to people. And I think that's what the cultural aspects of this project is about, that somehow the writing can weave together disparate kinds of elements and make it seem to work and give a place back some identity. Now, this is going completely against a rather heavy Marxist notion of economy and superstructure is all terribly peripheral. But I do think generally now that there is a space to give meaning, that the cultural project does give meaning to space, very powerful meanings, and often, you know, meanings that people want to inhabit.
This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid.
Okay. Right. Like I always have trouble with this sort of future of the city stuff and what might be nice or what little bits have been nice or what even the past things might be nice or might be nice, and it's always existing in some sort of precedent physical void and trying to think what you're really saying in those terms. You're really saying that actually what we need is a strong state and take a long-term view of the relationship between markets and society and intervening things like the land market. Otherwise, we're just left with these little tiny bits which I think don't amount to anything really, and we're probably going to let the short-termism of the market, and I think the Woking model will be the real model, which is that the town council that the big charity shops to open because they were reduced to taking the chain stores. And unless you come out with some direct and physical backing to these, you know, nice bits here, what might be nice there, surely it's just empty. Buildings, I might say.
I mean, all those slides that I showed actually were the results of actions by local authorities, some stronger than others, and some... I mean, obviously, we believe very strongly in powerful local authorities working in cooperation with communities.
So right back then, sort of people say Fabian farming. They were a strong statement.
No, I don't think the GLC was a Stalinist notion. I mean, it actually was a very empowering kind of body, and it shifted resources out of council to community. And I think it was a very strategic way, and it empowered community. exactly the way David Harvey was saying. It was a powerful institution. It was a social democratic institution. But it had very much an ideology of empowerment and putting resources out.
One quick one. It's not a question of a strong state. I think what we do need, architects, planners, urban cultural policy experts, or public policy people, or whatever, is a recognition of the fundamental role of the local state, not the strong state, the local state. There is so much grand theory which doesn't know how a local government organisation works. And I think one of the implications of what we're talking about today is that there is a real need to situate that profile of the local state into the process. We need to understand who has, as it were, first jurisdiction over the resources of the built form. It's an argument I'll throw out.
Okay, thanks very much to Colin and Ken. Our next speaker is Blair Badcock from the University of Adelaide, but he comes to us today via the Netherlands, and he's going to be talking on building better cities, which in itself is a concept that was heavily market researched, at least in the term of its name. Blair.
Without jolting you around too much, I'm going to have to move you from the local to the central and from culture to politics. That's not necessarily my inclination, but it's certainly the way this paper took shape when I was preparing it quite some time ago now. It's called Building Better Cities in Australia, Colin, more productive but less livable. And what I want to do really is confront some of the claims, at least, that have accompanied the evolution of this particular program. I think for people in the UK, you need to understand, notwithstanding all the problems and the lack of I suppose someone would claim it's impotent, but your urban program and those various aspects of it, the development corporations, now talking about regeneration agency and so on, city challenge, at least has continued to run even through the decade of a Thatcher government. After 1975 with Paul Whitlam government, there was a step-by-step dismantling of all forms of urban and regional policy in program, to the point where with the election of a Labor government in 1982, Hawke made it known that there's certainly no way that was going to reassert itself within public policy. And so the emergence of some sort of urban and regional agenda, of course, in Australia, produced not a little bemusement amongst people who, I suppose, somewhat more idealistically had been doing degrees and so on, or being actively involved in policy in the early 70s. What I want to say about building better cities and the evolution of the program is to suggest how it moved initially from a focus, although not a sole focus, quite obviously multiple objectives, but I would claim that at least the dominant focus at the first was really a focus on, again, back to that almost that liberal social justice agenda, provision of needs. It was needs-based, and in Brian Howell's early speeches, which in a sense anticipated the program, he talked about trying to improve working and living environments, because in the first phase of the Hawke program, the big macroeconomic questions had been addressed. We certainly reduced tariffs enough to disembody manufacturing in Australia every bit as ably as you have managed to in the UK. We have deregulated the financial system in different ways, but with no different, not too different effects in terms of the property market, and the same sorts of losses that have been enjoyed by not just the state banks that you read about, but also the private banking sector has lost probably 3 or 4 times the money that was lost by the 2 state banks in Australia. So you have this this initial concern then, which in a sense seemed otherworldly from the past of Brian Howe, and that's how this program was first introduced. Then, very quickly, it shifted to a focus on productive cities and building better cities. Better cities became building better cities. The thrust of the program then shifted to productive cities, partly because of the failure of the initial phase of macroeconomic reforms to really fundamentally change the health of the economy. And so building better cities became part of the program then of microeconomic reform. So there was a focus on the labour market, reforms of the labour market, deregulating the labour market, combined with retraining, reskilling and so on. So a lot of money, the amalgamation of employment and with education to a super department, and so on. You get the picture. The suggestion then by the late 80s was that one of the things that had been lacking was sufficient funds for infrastructure, the same sort of neglect of funding for the strategic infrastructure, road and rail, in much the same way as you people, I suspect, have seen over the decade in the UK. So these are the things that came together then in this second or third phase. And then, of course, with the crisis of unemployment by the middle of this year in June, because the economy wasn't responding to the One Nation statement with the election of Paul Keating as Prime Minister, 6 months after in a sense, the announcement of the One Nation statement, unemployment topping 11% for the first time. The government then realising, of course, that it did have a crisis of legitimation on its hands. And so the next phase, building better cities in a sense is co-opted, along with a number of other programs, including the Commonwealth and State Housing Funding Agreement funds, local government expenditure, and so co-opted along with those sorts of programs to try and create some jobs, get some job generation going. And so we've seen 3 shifts of emphasis in the process, and building better cities has really been caught up with this. I guess that's what I'm saying about the politics of it. Building better cities was a program that, in a sense, was designed on the run. And while I don't have time to I suppose, take you through the argument in a more coherent way, what I thought I would do is just show you through a series of transparencies. There's only one line of that table that I just wanted to show you, and that's that line there, which is the Building Better Cities funding. The point of it is that prior to 92-93, there was no funds in a sense being allocated to any sort of approach to your urban program and the various forms that it takes. The other part of this context is to look at funding in the transportation and communication sector and housing and community amenities through the 1980s. And not too different picture, I suspect, in the UK, where there's been a fall in real terms. In the first part of the first Hawke administration, we talk about the housing-led recovery, and a lot of money, public funds, injected into the economy through the housing sector, first new start home owners and first-time home buyers and so on, plus funds for the public housing program. And you can see that. And then a decline in real terms from the middle of the 1980s, and you can see what's happening in terms of funding for infrastructure. So that's the context in which Building Better Cities was conceived. as I'm speaking. In terms of the politics of it, with the challenge to Hall midway through 1991, this was the first challenge, probably you won't recall it. Quite clearly there's a deal done between the left of the Labour Party and the Hawke government, Hawke being very conservative, and because of the support Hawke received from the left, Brian Howe's leader of the left becomes Deputy Prime Minister and replaces Keating. And so this program, which, as I say, was conceived as a way of beginning to address the deteriorating living and working conditions of many of the Labour seats, emerged. And so $816 million was voted at that stage in midway through 91 to begin funding some demonstration projects, which were about, despite the rhetoric, which were about improving practice, trying to improve urban management per se, trying to improve the coordination between federal, state and local government in each of these selected areas. I'll show you the rest in a minute. Then, with the second challenge, of course, Hawke was unseated, taking place late in 1991, and then the question was whether or what would happen to better cities at that stage. Many thought it would die a natural death and never to be thought of again. But in fact, because Keating did draw support from the left, there was certainly a commitment there. People wondered whether or not, though, he would simply claim upon assuming Prime Ministership that priorities were shifting, funding was such that the funds weren't there for better cities. And it was also felt because of the nature, the concentration of power within the bureaucracy, within the Treasury, Finance, and Prime Ministers and Cabinets departments, the core departments, which really have become, in a sense, overpopulated by economists persuaded of a single mind in terms of their ideological leanings. And a piece of work by Michael Pusey has shown it's a book called Economic Rationalism and in Canberra, has shown the extent to which within those powerful departments as opposed to the human service department, the extent to which there is a consensus ideologically. And so the feeling was there would be such resistance within those departments to the objectives and the sentiments of this program that how would be defeated. However, that didn't happen, but what happened was Keating put together his One Nation statement, which was about trying to inject funds through infrastructure funding, inject funds to try and do something about the deficiencies, the supposed deficiencies, structural deficiencies in the economy. This is partly because investment in new plant and equipment has continued to decline steadily. In the last half of the 80s into the 90s, despite the fact that interest rates have now fallen to about, I think about 7%, 6.5%, 7%. In real terms, they're higher because inflation now is about 1.5%. However, investment into the tradable goods sector, which is supposed to be where our productivity is, or export earnings are going to be generated, is simply not responded. Now what happened then at the beginning of 1992, the beginning of this year, with the One Nation statement is that we sat back, and of course this investment in railways, roads and so on, being not only capital intensive, which was never going to generate many jobs, it wasn't certainly not the objective of it, but also most of this road and rail building machinery and a lot of the materials even now have to be imported. And so we've got a lag there as well. So midway through this year, unemployment, as I said, had topped 11%, and as most of the daily newspapers said, of a single mind as they've been over the last 2 or 3 weeks in the UK. Unemployment, a national outrage, at which Labor finally had to part company with its public service and begin funding job creation in a good old-fashioned Keynesian way. Not in significant terms, about 3.5 to 4 billion, for the same reasons that the expenditure and public funds, the stimulatory expenditure in the UK economy, I could think will be of the same order of magnitude. Nevertheless, that funding has gone to local governments to hopefully not only create jobs but to stimulate small-scale capital expenditure. Now, the list of areas selected state by state, you won't get through this, but it gives you some idea of the nature of the program and the range of area improvement, because that's what the focus of it is, the range of area improvement strategies being adopted. It tends to fall into 2 kinds: corridor development and the upgrading, the redevelopment and recreation of spaces, which are these old waterfront areas, docklands areas, and so on. Now, while these are primarily designed as demonstration projects, as I say, there's certainly a realism about what can be achieved through these. It's hoped, though, as demonstration projects, they will provide new ways of perhaps solving all problems. The arguments about building better cities, of course, relates to the extent to which this is going to generate or stimulate the sort of, or underwrite private investment to the extent that cities will become more productive. Now, quite clearly, when you look at each of these, it's very hard to link some sort of macroeconomic objectives like making our cities more productive for private capital with things like extending a growth corridor, putting a railway down that's going to increase commuting time by 10 minutes at the most. And likewise, a sort of mixed-use zones, Darling Harbour style and Piedmont Baltimore, all of these areas, it's really very difficult. It's absolutely very difficult to see a logical connection between the productive city objective and these sorts of demonstration projects. It becomes even more difficult to tie this funding with the job creation strategy. I mean, it simply becomes incidental if jobs are created in the process. The job creation will be achieved far more through direct funding to local governments. Now, in terms of how it may compare or may not compare with the programs in the UK, and I guess I'm talking about City Challenge, which is the latest version of several, or many versions of, I suppose, urban policy, which is directed to area improvement. I would argue that at least the objectives are more explicit in the City Challenge program. It really is, when you go through them, they are addressed to unemployment, to skill building, to trying to address perhaps truancy, about housing stress, about living and working conditions. So again, it may simply be that that's rhetoric, but that's missing altogether from building better cities. It's about urban management, and it's about productive cities, about providing this underwriting to private capital, particularly as it links with the provision of infrastructure. So, maybe I'll leave it there. I could provide you with details of the levels of funding and so forth, but I think I've covered the main points that I wanted to cover. As I say, perhaps not as coherently as if I've been able to take more time over the paper, but I'll
Thanks, Blair. Questions from the floor? Anna.
Available to those parts of cities that have urban program status. And so it means, say, an area like King's Cross in Camden, which has got horrendous social problems, is not able to get hold of any city challenge funding. And that is a major problem. It's not even, I think the program is small, but it's not even one where there's even open competition. It's one which is very inclusive to start off with, and it means that it has a very, very minor impact, except on certain favored areas.
Yes, I'm sorry if I did imply I was making a favourable comparison. I think I was simply drawing a comparison without making a judgment about it, because I agree from what I've read. I mean, I understand that the funding, and if funding proceeds into the next financial year, I understand some real doubt about that. But that it's being drawn off the total urban vote and redistributed through the City Challenge program where those areas are successful. So I do appreciate those deficiencies, if you like, in the City Challenge program, and I'm certainly not trying to suggest that it's more favourable for those sorts of reasons, simply saying that's where how the objectives differ in the two. I mean, there's absolutely no attempt to address living and working conditions in building better cities. I mean, that would be an incidental spin-off if in some of these localities, perhaps some people are employed on a temporary basis. They wouldn't necessarily be local people that are employed. Who knows where the contract work comes from, the contractors come from.
Jen?
I was just curious about your really you subscribe to the view, as I do, that the sub-agenda might be reform. That's not so tough, but the agenda might be reform. And yet you're saying that the money spent is not going to do anything for improving productivity. And I was just thinking of the example of the Southeast Queensland corridor, that's one I know best, where the idea is very explicitly about developing a hidden rail link, as you rightly point out, from the ports area, and the idea being sort of containerisation of Australia. So I mean, that's very clearly a commitment of funds to developing citizen infrastructure for economic development.
Yeah, one of the points that I did omit, which I would have drawn out, was a comment on that by Ken Ogden, who's Professor of Transport Engineering at Monash. And he's arguing to the extent that we do remove these bottlenecks or improve these bottlenecks around the wharf areas, the container areas, improve the rail infrastructure within the city, that will in fact bring more congestion, increase the trucking, and so within the city itself. So functionally, while it may be sort of productive from one sector, from a transport sector point of view, it's not necessarily, and just for a national transport sector point of view, it's not necessarily going to be productive from the urban transport sector point of view. So, on the corridor is not, that's not, the argument wouldn't apply with that same force, but if you look at the map of where most of this expenditure is directed, it may be too small. Diamond Freight Terminal in Melbourne is certainly one of the things that Ogden has in mind. This funding here, there's no doubt that this funding, which is not part of Better Cities, that's part of the One Nation funding, is certainly going to remove some of the bottlenecks that occur in transportation level. But I'm saying you can't make that argument for Better Cities, and the political rhetoric is predicated on that sort of argument. This is one nation, not better cities. I guess I'm just confronting the rhetoric and the claims made as Build Better Cities went to building better cities has now gone to an emphasis on job creation. And if I can find a quote from John Dawkins, it would just, it will just, as I say, reinforce my point about that. I could pick 3 quotes that would show the shift over a period of about 12 months as this program, as I say, took shape on the run. Okay, only 700 extra jobs will be created through building better cities and bringing forward some of the funding, in fact, from 94, 95, and I think 94, 95, 95, 96. But this is what Dawkins said. Projects funded through the Building Better Cities program will provide a boost to local economic activity, and some will help overcome specific impediments that may be restricting growth and limiting employment opportunities. So formally, there's absolutely no mention of employment in those first 2 forms of the urban program, the Commonwealth Urban Program. In fact, there's a positive denouncement of any profligate job creation, that sort of work creation strategy of the early 1980s. And so I think particularly because of the influence of the bureaucracy in those 3 departments. And the interesting thing is that the Labor government held out so long against its own against its party support to do anything about deteriorating unemployment right through the late 80s and into the early 90s. I guess that's what surprised a lot of people.
Okay, thanks, Blair. I should explain that unemployment in Australia has only recently gone above the 1 million mark for the first time, which is a big issue in the local economy, a magic figure. Okay, next, the last speaker for this session is Joan Lomholt from the University of Humberside, and she's going to be speaking on the city as theme park. And perhaps I should forewarn Jane that there are a few people here today who like abandoned theme parks. Jane.
I'm afraid I don't have anything to offer on the line of building better cities. As a matter of fact, I think perhaps the content of my paper, which I'm not going to read, is an indication that such things are of the past. Indeed, perhaps that what we're hearing here now is the rattle at the back of a throat in some rather, dare I say it, exquisite course. Okay, I'm going to ask you to shift perspective for the duration of my short talk, and perhaps inhabit a space which is parallel to the one that we've been inhabiting so far this morning. The recent debate on the future of cities has identified a strand which deals with non-urban conglomerations as places of urban activity, as we tend to understand it. Such places include airports, malls, and theme parks. Now, the characteristics that these exhibit are the following. Locus has become irrelevant. Density has become transitory. Heterogeneity charged with sameness, and time has been suspended. These spaces have been charged with leisure activity as opposed to urban interaction. I would propose that one needs to examine the underlying experiential myths to find an indication of how one might respond ethically and appropriately for an urbanism which is supportive of individual and collective needs. The city, as we know it, as I said in the introduction, is in grave trouble, if not dead. It's grappling for all sorts of possibilities to survive. Perhaps even looking at the successes of some of these pseudo-urban conglomerations that I've been mentioning as a way out. So one finds the day of themed city is at hand. I'm going to refer to 4 themed cities: Venice, Billund, which is the site of Legoland, Euro Disney, and Columbus, Indiana, a city in its own right with a themed activity. I'm not going to say a lot about Venice. It's in my paper, and I think all of you, to prove the point, have a very clear idea of the myth of Venice in your minds, perhaps different for each of you. She, of course, the Serenissima, has been established on the cultural horizon for a long time. But already in the middle of the previous century, one became aware of her decline. Henry James, in the Aspirin Papers in, I believe it was 1887, compared Venice with the waning beauty of one of his main characters, Mrs. Bordereau. Thomas Mann, a few years later, at the beginning of this century, in Death in Venice, likewise draws a parallel between Venice and Aschenbach. The essence is, not very long ago, there was an article in The Independent with the headline, "The Rip-Off Merchants of Venice." And I think that places perhaps Venice very clearly in the perspective that one could see her today. The essences are made in Taiwan, and the tourist hordes are literally ruining the city. The highly charged qualities of her past history, art, and architecture have been arrested in a static display. The old myths attenuated and replaced by pungent essences. Billund, a very small, unobtrusive city in the Danish countryside. Actually, it doesn't qualify as city, but it is the urban basis for the activities of the Lego industry, Lego group, as they call themselves. It has a population of 8,000. The park itself is a recreation center for people of all ages, they advertise themselves, which has 1 to 20 models of famous buildings, streetscapes, monuments, some of them perhaps non-existent but fabricated there out of fancy. There's something intrinsically disarming about small scale, about Denmark, about Legoland and Lego itself. This disarmingness, I would suggest, tends to place fantasy and to market fantasy in the realm of the ordinary. Belief in Legoland is readily suspended. Dreams are encouraged, however, action is curtailed. The motto of Lego is only the best is good enough. This very neatly couples the idea of best to both the visitor and the Billund inhabitant who produces the goods. The myth of egalitarianism is reinforced. Euro Disney, a recreation of other Disney parks, a recreation of other Disney parks in our own backyard in France. It's about simulation, inauthenticity, the unreal, funfair virtual reality. Freedom and choice have been preempted by the presentation of specific ideas and by material organization of events. It's a mythical world where the unsightly dirt of any kind is discouraged, it's unacceptable, it's cleaned away before your eyes. And this also sets up the parameters for one's behavior. The myth is of the hegemony of American values, sanitized out of recognition. Now, Columbus, Indiana, I would suppose that many of you have not heard of Columbus before. It's a very small town in southern Indiana, not far from Cincinnati, not far from Louisville, Kentucky, and not far from Indianapolis. So it's located in a very key position here in the tri-state area. It has a history going back just over 150 years, but in actual fact, it first came to life about 50 years ago. Columbus is the site of the Cummins engine plant, the diesel motors. And about 50 years ago, not 50 years ago anymore, but 50 years ago, Elias Saarinen was commissioned to build, a private commission to build a church in the town. And this was beginning of architecture comes to town, architectural awareness in Columbus. And in 57, the Cummins Engine Foundation for Architecture was established. The foundation offers to pay architectural fees to architects selected from a short list put out by the AIA to do public buildings in the town. So here you have private enterprise paying for this activity, but for public buildings. And the architects are chosen by the public board of directors of whatever institution, hospital, school, whatever. In the intervening years, well over, well, 30, I think it's 32 to be exact, buildings have been built under this scheme. But in actual fact, Columbus, Indiana boasts well over 100 buildings, monuments, pieces of public art by famous architects or artists, privately funded. With this architectural awareness, the town has also discovered its roots and has launched itself on a conservation regeneration activity program of its now new historic center. Columbus has a population of 32,000, vaguely. The people there tend to be conservative. They probably voted for Clinton, however, yesterday. And the whole atmosphere of the town is one of low-key, middle-class conservatism. So it's a very good place for businesses to locate. And that is precisely how it markets itself. Since 1985, 21 new businesses have located in Columbus, adding 2,600 jobs to the list. So what do we see happening here? We see themed activity increasingly becoming the life raft of cities, or even replacing cities as places of urban interaction. One enters themed city in vacuous suspension mode, the mode of the desexed voyeur. If we extend that metaphor, one can see Venice as the weary prostitute, Legoland, the wholesome girl next door, Euro Disney, the tease, and Columbus, the high-class call girl. Okay, the effects on Venice, the fabric and its own civic identity is disintegrating. Billund, however, has a different profile. It has full employment of a meaningful kind, I suppose, and increased local standards of living. Euro Disney has, by Michael Sorkin, been compared as a cross between Garden Village and Toontown. I suggest this is a reminder that utopian escapism is two-dimensional. Columbus, I would describe as the absent city. The public has abnegated its role as public, and this actually makes reference to Colin, who isn't here now, who spoke about the difference between urbs and civitas earlier today. There is a general avoidance of the public in the town to interact with the town center. They tend to prefer to live in the suburbs, to work in the business parks, and hang out at the mall. All of these activities in the periphery of town. Themed mode has become a palliative for the impotence of the consumer. Nostalgia is what's really being marketed. The yearnings for a lost time and a condition, expanded and exploited to include the times and conditions which have never existed and which most probably never would exist. This marketing of nostalgia is also linked to the consumer through a mythical experiential condition. In Venice, regardless of who one is or what one comes from, one becomes the romantic. In Euro Disney, one becomes wholesome family. And in Columbus, one becomes the architectural buff as you sit on a coach that takes you around the city, pointing to famous buildings by famous people. A homogenization and sanitation of the consumer's reality is taking place here. And in the case of Columbus, this mythical identification is extended to a national level in reference to the pursuit of the American dream for people in other parts of the country, the idea from something small to something big, if we can do it, you can do it. There's an increasing encroachment of themed activity, and this seems to be desensitizing the individual as individual and promoting the individual as consumer. And this is seen quite clearly in the activity of travel. In the activity of travel, the myth of the destination is, in fact, what is marketed and what tends to determine one's choice of destination. This myth, like nostalgia, is tampered with, reducing it to essences, and these essences are marketed and sold or bought. Columbus does not market itself as a theme holiday destination. Its myth is strongly reinforced, however, by uncritical, unquestioning, and untheoretical journal articles. The superlatives abound. Best is a quantifiable entity suddenly, a commodity which can be bought. I don't intend to take issue with these claims here now. I would like to point out, however, that myth is alive and well and lives by unwitting collusion as well as by conscious manipulation. A few years ago, the indications that led one to question the future of cities were of a pragmatic nature. One worried about the size of cities, the infrastructure, pollution, crime, homelessness, socioeconomic structures. Today, one would question the validity of such factors isolated from the phenomenological realms of perception and experience. Myth is a natural activity of man. Its hijacking is commonplace throughout history, but it is now of increasing magnitude and consequence. Baudrillard's essay, The Year 2000 Will Not Arrive, I think it's called, he talks about the disappearance of history in this essay due to an inertia of the silent majority, the well-saturated silent majority. This is an appropriate lament to these unilateral constructions which establish the public as consumer in a private sector world. In this world, urban myth is streamlined into online, mainline, anonymous programs of conformity. The future could be a bleak one. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. A question specifically for Jane now, please. I might also point out that I think that some of the issues raised in this session will resurface in the panel discussion this afternoon.
Pleasure or fault?
Sorry?
It's pleasure. I mean, the joy of listening to the way you move words around the spaces, creating problem things for consumers, or problem things like myths which have been provided. That's a pleasurable experience. I enjoy that. Is there a problem involved further this kind of conception of the city? Or not city? There seems to be some kind of myth behind the myth that there's something not quite right, that it shouldn't have been like that. Vienna should be allowed to go somewhere. The other cities should have gone in a way other than this. So are you implying problem?
I think I am. I've actually asked myself the same question. If everything is so good, why not leave it? You know, exactly. If this is what mankind wants, let them have it. You know, I don't really believe this is what mankind wants. I think that perhaps if mankind wants it, we can have it. I think the underlying agenda is a political one, and privatization of the public realm is a very serious thing that we have to be very aware of.
I've got some difficulty because, in a sense, most cities can be themed. And there's the other question of whether the theme has a functional base, that it's coming out of a functional structure.
city, or whether it's coming out of historic or whatever. So there's that difference between sort of Lego city and Venice. But you could go through Britain and say, well, Coventry's a car-making city, Salisbury's a cathedral city, and all of this has been encouraged recently by the notion of urban marketing, whereas places like Wigan and Stockholm, for example, are frantically looking for their image and how they're going to somehow market that image. But I think in a sense, perhaps reflecting the last question, it's therefore important to distinguish between theme or image, which is almost inevitable, and indeed maybe a good thing, and hype, and the false promises of hype, and what the hype can hide, and the bad effects of urban marketing, which
I think most cities, whether we know them or not, do have an image that they market. Ashworth and Turner, I think, something like that, was on the heritage, it's not the heritage, I can't remember now, tourism, in cities, talks about it even from that, about how cities search for something to market themselves by. In a way of having a recognition within the city of what it's about too. I think it's an increasing problem in our time. I think it's a problem of our time that one needs that kind of activity for that. Chester today is in 3BD last week. Chester is confronting 1.5 million tourists a year. They're now thinking of locating businesses and housing outside the city so that the city can be visited with tourists and innovation. I think there are problems.
The interesting parallels that you draw from Legoland and from Louisiana, I think both of them are really interesting. And what I found in Legoland is that you go in there, you subscribe to the belief that anything can be made out of Lego blocks. You go to Columbus, Indiana, and you kind of believe that any architect, if you give them enough money, to build your church, hospital, or whatever. And there's this underlying, or this big brother, if you will, the Cummins Engine Company, because when I was there with a group of people, we never associated with the public in any sense. It's just as if we went to this gigantic garden museum, a grander scale of Legoland, if you will. But always in the back, there is this mention of Cummins Engine Company, the money that they put into the kind of aspirations that they had, and also Legoland, the company. What do you see the social dynamics of?
The social dynamic is actually quite different in both places. I mean, the character of the social dynamic of a country like Denmark, which is known as is quite different. And one's the popular imperialism that is becoming some of that also. And certainly the one that performed very much, I think, in Columbus. It's work that it's a question I'm working on, work that I'm doing at the moment. And one thing I didn't mention is the relationship of the patron, both in Columbus, but in the other place that I mentioned, what we're thinking of St. Mark, which is a patron to Venice, and the Olympic Christians, and I think his name is the founder of Lego, with the family concern, and how this has influenced the whole development of that city. I think the influence of J.R. Miller in Columbus has been tremendous. He's only still alive, he's a very old man. And he had, for some years now, been a member of the Christopher Prize Commission too. I think it's very interesting that when one looks at the buildings in Columbus, there's no great architecture. There's no great architecture at all. It's polite buildings, sprawled out on green fields. And if you go to books, still others, they're both in Lion Cave, Richard Mark, blah, 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 none of it, all the ones that are represented in London. They're not going to find photographs of the buildings in Columbus because those are not great buildings by the economy. And that's interesting.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. As I said, I think some of these issues will be taken up again in the panel discussion this afternoon. Luncheon is about to be served, and I'm pleased to say that our students attending are welcome to come for lunch, which wasn't what you were told before. Thank you.